Okay, I think it's time to start. Thanks for being on time here, and welcome from Germany. Actually, we had our first snow for this season, just started half an hour ago, so this is a special meeting in a way. Just if you're wondering what happened to your mics, I muted all of you to make sure that we don't have too much background noise. We will see. Maybe we have some breakout sessions later in little groups, and then I will switch it on, or we use the chat room. But from my experience, it's better to use the chat and to write when we have a group of such a size. My name is Christoph Schalk. As many of you know, I'm part of the NCD International leadership team together with Christian Schwarz and Adam Johnson. And our topic today is the minimum factor and, well, resource orientation. And I want to introduce you to a specific tool, or better, a process called the NCD solution cycle. Well, let me start with something that all of you know. It's the so-called minimum barrel. It is a key illustration at NCD. And we use that from the very beginning. We actually, Christian Schwarz had that, this minimum barrel, this illustration in a book published here in Germany, even before we did our large research project from 1994 to 1996. So at the very beginning, there was a hypothesis. The hypothesis that it makes most sense for a church to start on the lowest of 8 areas. Actually, at that time, it was 7 areas. You know this illustration. There are several staves forming this barrel, and the area where the stave is the lowest, that's the place where the water is flowing out. And in the picture, it means the worship service attendance. So the message of the picture, raise your quality at the lowest point, and then you will have an increase of your worship service attendance. In the very beginning, as I said, that was an hypothesis, but then we did this research project, and it was one of our key questions. Is that really true? Does it really make sense to focus on your lowest area of your, to focus on your weakness in a way? Does it really make sense to use the minimum factor to start the NCD process with? And we used a lot of research here to finally discover, yes, it makes more sense to start with the minimum factor compared to the maximum factor, or to any other of the 8 quality characteristics. Could have been that we find out it always makes sense to start with gift-oriented ministry, but no, it changed. It was not one topic we always could start with, but it was different topics in different situations, and it was always the minimum factor. However, having that said, the minimum factor strategy is also a major point of misunderstanding when it comes to the NCD concept and the NCD strategies. Especially with the notion that NCD is focusing on weaknesses. This was not really a problem here in the German culture, and I'm not sure about other European countries, because, well, let me say it like this. In Germany, we have a tradition on focusing on weaknesses sometimes, but other cultures are different. For instance, as much as I can say, as far as I can say, the North American culture is different. There is more a tendency to focus on strength, to focus on resources. So there was a certain notion. NCD is dealing with the minimum factor, is dealing with the weaknesses. So can that really be true? Well, let me ask you, when we look at this scale here, on the right-hand side, you see the focus on strength. On the left-hand side, you see the focus on weaknesses. You can use the annotation tools when you click on comment and then use the drawing one. What is your experience? Make your mark. Like, I did it right now in the middle. Just mark the line and show us what is your most frequent experience when you're working with NCD. Do people say you're focusing on strength, or do they say you're focusing on weaknesses? What kind of feedback do you receive? Just use the annotation tool now and show me what your experience is. Okay, you're not sure how to use the annotation tool. There is a menu where it says comment. Okay, yeah, you made it. Wonderful. You found it. Okay. Weakness is the focus, says one. Okay. Any other opinions? What do you see? Is it more on the strength? Is it more on the weakness? Okay, you're using the chat. That's fine. And most of you right. It's the focus on the weakness. Well, let me expand a little bit on this. 1 second. Just adjust the chat. So let me delete the annotations because we don't need it here on this one. Sorry. Well, what is the right strategy? Focusing on strength or on weaknesses? Let me use a comparison. Imagine you go to the doctor for a checkup, and you tell, and the doctor completely checks everything, and then he says to you, well, I have a good news and I have a bad news for you. The good news is your eyes are okay, but the bad news is you have a serious heart problem. But don't worry, the doctor says, simply focus on your strength, focus on your eyes, that's fine. You can ignore your weaknesses, you can ignore the problems with your heart. Well, what is the right strategy? See, when it comes to essential areas, to vital topics, you cannot ignore the weaknesses. You have to deal with them. You cannot simply focus on your strength and say, well, I have perfect eyes, but my heart, who cares? Yeah, you have to address these weaknesses. You have to deal with them. Nevertheless, having that said, there is another important thing. Even in the area of your minimum factor, there are resources. And this is now really important to understand the center of NCD. While we do focus on the minimum factor, and while we do not ignore some weaknesses that are there, and while we are focusing also on, and while we do not, well, sorry, while we do not ignore the weaknesses, we do focus also on the resources that are there in the area of our minimum factor. The minimum factor strategy does not mean that we're always focusing on problems. The minimum factor strategy does not mean that we analyze problems and analyze them and analyze them. A coaching colleague of mine said, the more you talk about problems, the bigger they get. Yeah? Problem talk creates problems sometimes. That's a key sentence in the solution-focused coaching. So it is important to work in a resource-oriented way, even in the area of your minimum factor. And by the way, the minimum factor can be very high. Now, I have seen churches where the minimum factor was at a level of 80 or even 90. So it is simply not fair to say that the minimum factor is a bad area or is a low area. It is simply the lowest of the 8. And by definition, one of them has to be the lowest. And at the same time, the maximum factor is not automatically a good area. I have seen churches where the maximum factor was at the level of 20. So there would be good reason to improve everything. The key question here is, where do we start because we have limited resources in terms of co-workers, in terms of time, in terms of finances, for instance. And the other key is, even in this lowest area, is something there. There are things that are already going well. There are resources that we can use, and we can build upon them. We can develop them further instead of declaring them to be problems. So even the lowest stave is a resourceful area. The minimum factor area is a resourceful area. And for many churches, it is important to understand that, so that they do not get depressed, but can, with a lot of hope, work in their minimum factor area. Now, do you have any ideas how we can focus on strength in the area of the minimum factor? Well, I will not give you the mic now, but let's use the chat window. What are your ideas? What can be done in the area of the minimum factor to focus on strength, to focus on resources, to use what's already there? Please feel free and write it in the chat window. And make sure that you send your messages to everyone. Some are sending private messages to me. It's important that you send it to everyone so that we can see it. Yes, you can look at the status guide to identify strong responses. Yes. Yeah, looking at good items and Profile Plus. Focus on need-oriented evangelism through the maximum factor of holistic small groups already existing. Yes. And at the end of the cycle, celebrate the growth. Yes. Yeah. And what can you do at the very beginning? Yeah. If the worship is minimum, there is still worship happening. That's a good, important point, of course. And you can focus on the positive things. Yes. Yeah. Recommendation to use NCD insights. Good point here from Norway. We can use our gifts. Well, and we can even use the gifts if that is not a strength. Even if gift-oriented ministry is a low area, people do have gifts because they have the Holy Spirit. God has gifted them. They simply haven't discovered it. Yeah, but there are gifts. There are a lot of uh, uh, positive things already there. Yeah, wonderful what you're writing. Thanks so much. Yeah. I think it is very important that we have this perspective when we're working with churches and helping them through the NCD process, when we are coaching them, that we are not problem oriented. It's not about analyzing problems all the time and focusing on problems. It's focusing on resources as a starting point, focusing on resources in the minimum factor area and develop that further. And I have an approach for you, a process that is called the solution circle, the NCD solution circle. And today I want to introduce this process to you. And some steps may sound familiar to you, but I hope that you get some new ideas from that as well. Coaching with the NCD solution cycle means that you are focusing on the resources and on solutions all the time, not on problems. It means that you are also ignoring sometimes the causes of problems, because you see, people have assumptions about problem causes, but that is in a way it is constructed in their minds. what am I saying here? There's a theory called constructivism, which means that people construct a reality in their imagination. And we can spend a lot of time analyzing these ideas of about what the problems are, but there is no proof that that is reality. It is, first of all, it is their explanation of the world, and we can waste a lot of time with this. Instead, very often it makes more sense to focus on solutions, to focus on the resources and build new resources, new solutions from that. So creating choices, leaving behind the attitude, well, we have tried everything, but nothing works. Yeah, we can use the limited resources, the limited time to explore new ways of of creating progress. So to compare the two different mindset, a problem-focused mindset with a solution-focused mindset is here in this list of questions. A problem-focused mindset would ask, how did the problem arise? Maybe who or what caused the problem? Why did the person do it like this? Yeah, why did he do it wrongly? What is the worst thing about it? Why is this so? This why question is not very helpful in the coaching process. Instead, it is more helpful to focus on ways to solve problems when you're asking, what do you need in order to solve this problem? Or the so-called the so-called miracle question. If a miracle were to solve all the problems, what would things look like? How might the person behave in the future if there's a problem person in your church? What exact changes should be made in the future? What kind of behavior would make an outsider notice if you have achieved your goal? So you realize this is a completely different focus, focusing on things in the future, focusing on resources, focusing on improvements, focusing on new perspective, and not analyzing the problem all the time. So the NCD solution cycle leads you step by step through a process of discovering resources, developing solutions, and not going into the trap of problem solving. It starts with preparing the ground. Well, that basically means to build a good relationship with the people you're working with in a church when you're their coach. You have to clarify expectations and goals. It is also necessary to talk about the hot topics, which is the challenges, the problems, because in a group setting, even if you follow a solution-focused approach, in a group setting, you will have, at least there is a danger of negative group dynamics if you completely ignore it, and there's no place to talk about it shortly. Then we will focus on highlights in the past. Yes, a solution-focused approach can look at the past, but in a resourceful way. And that's why while we identify positive situations, highlights from the past. Then we will look to the future. How would the future perfect look like? So we imagine our ideal future because we need a good goal that we are aiming to. Scaling dance, that is a method I will explain later. Then we plan for next steps, and everyone has a personal mission to be part of the implementation. Now, what's the setting for the solution circle? The full solution circle can be a workshop that goes over 1 or even 2 days when you're working with a larger group. But you will realize that you can use parts of the solution cycle in different settings. You can use single modules for a 1-hour meeting, for a 4-hour team coaching. Yeah, so there are several puzzle pieces that altogether build a full picture, but you can also make sense with some individual puzzle pieces. I guess you will realize that when I walk you through them. Let's start with the first one, prepare the ground. Well, um, when you uh, make contact with the church and they invite you to be their coach, you probably talk with their leadership team or with their pastor, and you come to certain agreements. Yeah, you agree upon the way how you coach them, how often you will be there, what you're exactly doing. Is it a coaching process for the leadership, for the whole church? Are you doing workshops? Is it just a phone call? Whatever it will be. Now, the solution cycle that I show you here is for a team setting. So we're talking about a team coaching or a team workshop. Um, maybe an evening, maybe a day or so. And when you're there for the first time, of course, you will summarize the previous history. Yeah, you will summarize what you already discussed, maybe, for instance, with the leadership. And you can also name some strength that you already realized when you visited this church, maybe for the first time, or maybe you already know them. And you can make compliments and name resources that you already see to give it a positive start. Then preparing the ground also means clarifying the roles. You as the coach, you are the expert for the process, for the methods, but the team, the church members, they are the experts for their own church, for the content, to say so. And maybe you also need some rules, especially if there's, let's say, a kind of a conflict situation in the church. Then it's good to have rules, how a positive discussion would look like, things like that. But very often that's not even necessary because, well, you realize that they really want to work together and change something. After starting like this and preparing a good relationship and a good foundation, um, you continue by clarifying expectations and goals. And a very simple tool that I like to use in this context is the APA analysis. It is basically a structured kind of brainstorming where you invite everyone to to say what they want to achieve, what they want to preserve, and what they want to avoid. Um, Very often I take notes at the flip chart or on a whiteboard. When I have a church with a very positive mood, a very positive mindset, very goal oriented, I typically start with the achieve section, and then we look at what they want to preserve because it's already running well. They have positive experiences. They're talking about values they want to keep. And then I continue with avoid, what should not happen in this process. When I'm working with a church where I see there's a lot of resistance against change, then I may start with preserve, and first ask them what should not change, what should stay as it is, what do you want to preserve, and then we get a list of things. Some of these things are, well, they are good, and that's why they are on the list. Sometimes there are also points on the list where I would say, from my outside perspective, yeah, I understand that you don't want to change that, but you better do. But this is not the room for discussion. It's just to make 3 lists and give me and give them an overview and also a shared agreement what they as a group want to achieve, preserve, and avoid. When I'm working with a smaller group, instead of using this APA analysis, I may have a discussion with everyone individually in front of all, of course, and I would ask them, when this day is over, what kind of result would you like to see? What should the outcome of this day be so that you go home from here and say, this was a really helpful and valuable meeting today, a good workshop. So what kind of result do you want to see? And I have a little discussion with each individual group member. But for time reasons, I would only do this with smaller groups, maybe 4, 5, 6 people. If there's a larger group, I prefer to do it with the APA analysis. Then we would also look at hot topics. Yeah, as I said earlier, there can be a very strange group dynamic if we completely ignore the problems and don't give the group some room to mention what they see as difficult areas. So in a solution-focused way, well, what I would like to avoid here actually is that we have an endless discussion about problems, so that we have an endless analysis of problems. So instead of doing this orally, I do that in writing. I hand out 3 to 5 post-it notes to each of the team members, to each of the people in the group, and I ask them that per post-it note, they write one key factor that they see, one reason, one cause that they see why this church has this minimum factor. So everyone would identify 3 to 5 reasons for the current minimum factor. And then we stick all the notes on a wall. And after everyone put the note on the wall, all the participants would silently group these notes according to similarities. So let's say you have a group of 10 people, everyone gets 5 notes, then you have 50 notes sticking there on the wall. But it would be very typical that behind these 50 notes, there are only, let's say, 6 or 7 topics. And you really can group them by these topics. So I asked them to find these groups, to identify these groups, let them all work, but I let them work silently, no talking. Yeah, so that don't start a discussion, and that also the more introvert and more silent people have a chance to influence the grouping of the similar notes. Well, then we would read all them aloud. All the groups would give the groups headlines and discover by doing so the 5 to 7 key issues. And then maybe we have a short discussion about these causes and reasons for the minimum factor. But sometimes I let them just look at that, and typically they would affirm, yes, that's why we do have the minimum factor. I have prepared something for you on a different website. I give you the link here in the chat so that you can simply click there now and switch to this website. And then I invite you to do a little affinity exercise with me right now. So the question is, of course, now we are not collecting reasons for a minimum factor because that's not something we can talk about here. But I would like to talk about with you about resource orientation in the minimum factor area, what we just did in the chat room. Yeah, what are your ideas? Yeah, maximum 3 posts per person. Simply double click here on the blue screen then, or click on the plus in the right lower corner, and then you can write your idea, and then we will group that. Yeah, just click on the link in the chat window, and then another window will open, and there you can type something. I will just type an example for you, and then I invite you. Yes, find. Yeah. Okay. I will quickly change the screen sharing so that you can follow here even if you're not on that screen. So using empowering leadership, find any above average responses in the minimum factor area. Yeah. Low free thought, Trinitarian models as a resource. Yep. Yep. You can pray. Look for interrelated strength in the highest 10 chart. Yes. Okay, some more thoughts. Otherwise, it may be difficult to group them. So I will start doing the grouping for you now. So here's a first group that is focusing on items on the questionnaire. Yeah, average responses, above average responses, then the highest 10 chart, find items which have an influence on the minimum factor and are good. Yeah. So then build up the spiritual drive. I connect that with pray. So here resources. So now we could even give that the same color. And sometimes it happens that something individual is left. Yes, that there is one note and that this doesn't fit in any group. So the simple rule is that the person who wrote the note can finally decide in which group it goes or if it stays alone. We will not complete this exercise now, but I wanted to give you some practical experience how that works. And you can see you can even do this online. The tool that I was using here is called Padlet. It can be used in a free version, which only limits the number of so-called Padlets you use. So if you are doing virtual coaching over the internet or over the phone with the church, you still could do this exercise. Yeah, so that's what I quickly wanted you to show. Okay, now let's go back to the PowerPoint presentation. One moment. Okay, now you should see the PowerPoint and we continue to the next step. After the hot topics, we move forward to the highlights. And what I really there are different ways now to work with the highlights. One is simply to use a scale from 1 to 10 and say and let's say, well, right now, where would you see your church and where do you see situations in the past that were higher than the current? So when they say from a scale to 1 to 10, overall we see our minimum factor area at the 5. Well, let's look for situations where it was at a 6 or at a 7. What situations is that? But what I prefer even more is storytelling. So I invite all the participants of this coaching workshop to find a situation that they personally see as a highlight in the area of the minimum factor. So where they would say, we need more like this. Yeah, we need more of this. Then our minimum factor area would improve. Yeah, so in the minimum factor area, in the so-called weak area, discover little things. Yeah, sometimes it's not a big thing. It's little things. But if that happened more often, if that happened more consequently, if that was developed further, then it would really improve and make a significant difference in the area of the minimum factor. And then I ask the group to write the story down, everyone for his or her story, one page maximum. So I hand out blank sheets of paper, hand out pens, and ask them to write the story down. And afterwards, everyone reads his or her story to all the others. And then we work with glue dots to discover the most resourceful stories. When I do a workshop like this, I want to find out, is that something where everyone agrees, yes, we need more of this. Yeah? And then the fantastic thing that happens is they realize it's not impossible. We already did it. Maybe we only did it once, but we can repeat it. We can do it again. So this is a solution-focused, resourceful way of developing the minimum factor area a step further. Yeah. Then we already move forward to the future perfect. Also here, we can use different methods. When we're using a scale from 0 to 10, again, we could talk about the 10. How would the 10 look like? But what I personally like is the so-called miracle question. That is a question that comes from solution-focused coaching. And it is an invitation to imagine such an ideal future. So typically I would ask everyone to, to sit down if they're not sitting already, and just to relax a little bit, and then to imagine that after this workshop, let me read it as it is here in the U version. Imagine after this workshop, you go home. They make a little break so that they really can follow me in their imagination. Yeah, and this evening, you lay down to sleep. And while you're sleeping, a miracle or something like a miracle happens overnight. And that's the scenario that they imagine. They sleep and a miracle happens. And all the problems in the minimum factor of your church disappeared. Well, you don't know that the miracle happened because you were sleeping. So how would you notice the next morning that the miracle had happened? How would you notice that? No one will tell you. Yeah, it simply happened while you were sleeping. What will be different? What would first cause you to recognize that something is different? What would be the first little indicator? And how would others realize that a miracle happened? I would read this very slowly to my audience so that they really find the time to think about it, to reflect, to use their creativity, their fantasy, their imagination, really to go a little bit into the future and to find out how the ideal future would look like and how they would realize that something, like a miracle had happened. And then I asked them to take some notes. And after that, I would ask them to break into little groups, 3, 4, 5 people, depending on the overall group size. And they should discuss about these questions. What would be different in your version of the miracle? What would be the first indicators of this positive change? And what could this mean for your current reality? So how could you take ideas from this miracle question, from this miracle exercise, from your fantasy in a way, and apply that to your current reality to improve things? What solution ideas could you generate from the miracle exercise? And that is very often a very creative part. Yeah, it gives them a lot of creative energy, and they start talking, developing solutions, developing ideas, not focusing on things that are not possible, not focusing on problems any longer. The scaling dance, I already mentioned it when we were talking about the highlights and the future perfect. It's nothing else than simply using a scale from, in Germany we say from 0 to 10. In some other countries, you prefer to say from 1 to 10. Yeah, that's our culture here, we believe in the absolute zero. You could write that on a flip chart as a simple scale from 0 to 10, or work on the floor. Yeah, very often I say here, this is my window. This would be the 10. There is a wall that would be the 1 or the 0. And now stand on the floor and show me where you see the situation. Yeah, what is the status quo? Where are positive exceptions in the past, the highlights? Yeah, where would you like to be in the future? Where would you like to be in a year from now? And how does that look like? Yeah, important. Everyone makes his or her personal assessment. This is about individual perspectives. It's not about averages. Differences is information. Yeah, it's important to notice all the differences. And you can ask as a coach for the differences. How do you explain these differences? What's the difference between the current situation and the one? What's the difference between the current situation and the 10? Or what would be different when you moved one step ahead, compared to where you are right now? What would be different then? What would you do as a church, as a team, as an individual? And what would enable you to do so? Well, then we can already talk about next steps. Yeah, what we did so far, we generated building stuff, building resources, yeah, to build solutions, to build new ideas and action plans, not focusing on problems, yeah, but discovering resources in the history of this church, discovering highlights, creating new ideas. And so when you're talking about the next steps, typical or helpful questions are questions like these. What must you do to advance one step toward the 10? Or what can you personally do to make this happen? How would you notice that your situation had improved a little? It's important that they can describe what would be different. Otherwise, they set very abstract goals, but they cannot concretely give you an example or concretely describe what would be different. And then a question that sounds a little strange at first sight, but also can help to get a new perspective is the last one here on the list. If you were the coach, what would you recommend yourself as the next step? Well, coaching, you know that coaching is not about giving recommendations or giving advice, but that's not the point here. It's simply going into a different role and looking at the situation with a different perspective. And I have seen people who said just before, well, I have no idea what I could do or what we could do as a church. And then I asked this question and I said, yeah, if I was the coach, then I would do it like this. Yeah. So simply changing the perspective very often helps you to come up with new ideas. So last but not least, the personal mission. This point is about making sure that everyone is involved in the change. So the goal is to help apply the measures in everyday life, especially by the means of observation and actions, of course. So I would give the group members some homework. And the homework, of course, could come from an action plan. Yeah, who is doing what by when, and what are the steps to reach these goals. But very often, I also give them a simple observation exercise, because change has to do a lot with the inner attitude, with the mindset. And if they go too quickly into action, it can end up with some hyperactivity, but not real qualitative change. Well, we do need action, yeah. So I don't want you to misunderstand me. But at the very beginning of such a process, it can make sense to tell them, don't change anything yet. Just make observations. Yeah, and for every positive situation that simply happens, yeah, you can, well, give this person a candy or say thank you to somebody, but simply observe. The interesting thing is they will start changing something in a positive way because they observe others, which means they are aware of the need for positive change and that change themselves. And at the same time, they give positive feedback to other people in the church, which reinforces positive behavior there. And well, change in churches starts with the personal mindset and the positive behavior of individuals. In church development and in the church growth movement, I've seen so often the approach to change structures, to change the organizational chart and things like that. It's about people. Yeah, we start with the mindset, with the attitudes, and the personal behavior. Well, let's look at the full NCD solution cycle again. Yeah, we started with preparing the ground, identify or clarified expectations and goals, identified hot topics in a written form without much discussion, then story sharing with highlights, the future perfect, the scaling dance, the next steps, and finally a personal mission, personal task maybe. Well, and sometime later, well, there's a question. Let me quickly read that. When in the NCD growth cycle do you see the NCD solution as most helpful? I don't see that as an either or. I don't see that as really alternatives. The solution cycle is a team coaching process. So it describes an outside process, how you coach a group of people, how you coach a team, how you coach a church over several months through all the different topics. And the NCD growth cycle I would use, well, that could be used by the church in between. Or it could be used in the action planning process. It could be used for discovering resources. So it's more interwoven. The follow-up. Well, maybe the follow-up is just one session a month later, or it's several sessions. Typically, I would start with highlighting or let the group highlight the positive changes since the last coaching session. So what has improved? And then we could look at a scale from 1 to 10 again. Yeah, where do you stand today with your minimum factor? Yeah, and how did you manage to get there? What did you as a team, as the church leadership or some working group in the church, what did you do to get there? And then we can talk about the next steps. Yeah, what are the next steps? How do we keep the process moving forward? And again, what should each person individually concentrate on? Okay, I see there are some questions. Let me just have a look at that. During the presentation, it was a little bit difficult to follow all of that. Let me see if I missed a question. Gary writes, this helps make the process personal. Personal transformation always precedes corporate transformation. Yes, I fully agree with that. Yeah, and let me see above what you wrote. Okay, there are a lot of comments, but please feel free to type your questions in right now, and then I try to answer right away, because this is my last slide on the solution cycle here. Any comments are welcome, but especially your questions now. And by the way, this webinar is being recorded. So tomorrow in 2 days, you will get the link if you want to review it or want to share it with somebody else, and you also will get the presentation. So would you use the solution cycle with each annual survey? Well, you see, um, let's assume there is a coach. Let's assume there is a church, and this church wants to work with you as a coach. You need a certain process. Yeah, and the solution cycle describes a coaching process over several months. Yeah, I described all the steps, which can be a one-day workshop. Um, but you can continue with that. So when you have your second meeting, maybe you won't go through the full cycle again. So let me go one slide backwards. But you maybe simply focus on the highlights since the last time, yeah, or you focus on the next steps. So this could be the outline for your coaching during the year. So it's not a question if I use it with each annual survey, but if the church wants me to help them as a coach, I need a process, and I think this is a very solution focused process. Does it make sense? Yeah, you're welcome. Any other comments or questions? What have you found to be the most difficult phase of this to implement? Um, one difficulty is to deal in a good way with the hot topics. Uh, People typically want to discuss their problems. Yeah, at least that's my experience here in Europe. Um, and there can be as I said earlier, there can be a bad group dynamic if they don't get some space for that. Um, and it is really a key that you don't have a long discussion here. So you give them space, but at the same time you limit the space. And a good way of doing this is the affinity exercise. Let them write it down, group it, but then stop with that topic. Um, Another challenge may be identifying highlights. That needs a little bit time, and depending on the mood of the group or depending on their mindset, yeah, they have easy access to that or not. Sometimes, well, it's so easy to forget all the good things that you experienced. So you need a good introduction to that, some motivation, so that they are open and find their stories and share their stories. Another question, would you use the follow-up questions before you start a new survey? You see, this is a very flexible process. You can change every part here. You can even change the order. You can use parts of that. So in a way, it depends on what you agreed upon with the church that you are coaching. When you come in only once, um, and there are churches that's from a coach perspective that is not ideal. Yeah, they do the NCD survey, they have one appointment with the coach, and then they go for a year or even two before they contact you again. This is not the ideal setting, but it's sometimes reality. A more ideal setting is to be in regular contact with them, maybe over this year. And yes, I would use the follow-up questions for some of these follow-up meetings during the year, and that would be before the next survey, of course. Yeah. Yes, so the idea is not to get stuck on hot topics. Absolutely, yeah. If let's say the whole solution cycle would be a one-day workshop, then working on the hot topics is probably half an hour. Yeah, I give them 5 post-it notes, and actually, if there's a large group, I give them only 3. Yeah, if it's a smaller group, I give them up to 5 post-it notes. They write it down. It takes them 5 minutes. We put them on the wall. Um, we group them. That's another 10 minutes maybe. We have a look at them, and that's it. Yeah, so maximum half an hour of a full day. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, the scaling dance. Let me expand a little bit on this. In a way, you could do the whole solution cycle only with the scale. Yeah, of course, preparing the ground, that's the starting point. But talking about expectations and goal basically means talking about the 10. Yeah, what kind of outcome would you like to see? Or it could mean uh, moving from 5 to 6 today. Yeah, so talking about hot topics, that would be the focus on the scale, the part of the scale that is already missing. Yeah, let's say they right now they are at the 6. So the what's not there between 6 and 10. The highlights would be positive exceptions on the scale in the past. Yeah, so where it was 7 instead of 5 or 8 instead of 4 or so. The future perfect again would be talking about the 10. The scaling dance would be looking for differences and discovering resources in these differences. The next step is moving one number higher on the scale. Well, and the personal mission, of course, is about implementation and observation. So, in a way, you really could. Well, let me put this here in the diagram. You could put a scale all the way long here through the whole cycle, if that makes sense here. Okay. Any other questions? Well, then I have a last slide for you. It's this one. This is our last NCD webinar for the International NCD Coach Community, but we already planned for the webinars in 2020. And it's not really long until the next webinar. It's just 2 months, February 12th, with Adam Johnson from Australia as presenter. Then Christian Schwarz will be the presenter on May 20th. I will be your presenter again in November 11th, or 11th of 11 or so. And well, there is an opportunity for one of our NCD national partners, or maybe even a coach from our coach community. So for you to give a presentation to the community in August. So if you think that you have a topic or a case study or anything worthwhile sharing in such a webinar in the NCD Coach community, please feel free to contact me. Send me an email and contact me, and then we will see if that's a good time for you. There, of course, August is still a couple of months ahead, so there may be even flexibility in this date. The other ones, they are set. So please let me know if you have something for the whole community. Okay, this was a little bit a shorter webinar today, just 1 hour, but we are at the end. Unless you have another question or comment, let me wait a minute. But otherwise, I wish you a great day, or here in Europe, a great evening, and well, have a blessed Advent time and Christmas time, and see you next year.